So, making sure you're reading papers as they're getting published that are relevant to your work. I always find it really helpful to review papers. So you could review papers either formally as a reviewer for a journal, or within your lab, if you have lab mates that are writing up their research, you can review their papers as well. If you are a graduate student with some writing experience or publication experience, you can serve as a reviewer for a journal. But I think reviewing other people's writing makes you a lot better of a writer. So if you haven't done that yet, that's a great opportunity. And a lot of journals are desperate to find reviewers because everyone's so busy. And then also attending extension events or webinars. Science for Success has a lot of really nice webinars we just wrapped up, but I know your individual states have all kinds of extension events. So that's a really nice way to learn that's not necessarily reading a paper. My advisor at Michigan State really emphasized to me the importance of designing your experiment correctly. So if your experiment's not designed correctly, that's going to end up with you not being able to publish your research at the end. So make sure you're setting up your experiment in a way that's randomized and replicated, and that will allow you to test your hypothesis. So very important to do early on. And then as you're doing your research, it's very important to keep really, really good records and organize your data. There's a lot of students who get to the end where they're trying to write their thesis or dissertation, and they're calling the farm manager saying, hey, what day did you plant? Or what kind of planter do you have? Or what kind of combine do you have? What rate did I spray that product? So as you're doing your research, make sure you're writing down the key dates, equipment that you use, methods that you used, and then organize your data in a really usable manner. So in terms of organization for your data, I use Excel. There's probably other platforms, but I use Excel. And I try to organize my data where it's really easy to run the statistics. I use SAS. But make sure everything's organized really well in some sort of spreadsheet. When you are writing your publication, you're probably going to have to reanalyze your data more than once, because your committee will suggest one thing, but then something else looks better. And I've even had it where I've had to revise my analysis after it's accepted. So I may have done one thing, but the reviewers were asking for something else or an additional analysis. So having everything organized where you can quickly do the analysis or redo it again is really helpful. Another common pitfall I see with students is that they have their Excel spreadsheet or data sheet, but then they don't have any units listed. And so that can be really problematic. So make sure all your data is labeled really well, so it's understandable to you and another person. For example, I had a student once doing biomass measurements for cover crops, and his Excel sheet was a number. It was 10. I don't know if that's 10 grams. I don't know if that's 10 pounds. I don't know if that's 10 ounces. I don't know what square area that was taken from. So just making sure you have really well labeled units in your Excel files or whatever you're using to analyze your data. So it's good to have a plan as well. So I try to recommend my students explicitly write out their objectives. Sometimes when they're first starting graduate school, the objectives are maybe kind of broad, but I think it's good to be as specific as possible because that'll shape your writing down the road. And also it'll shape how you do your analysis. So a lot of you will probably have giant data sets, and you could probably answer multiple objectives or multiple questions with your data. But for a manuscript, you usually have to narrow it down. And so having very explicit objectives will help you understand how to analyze your data to meet those objectives for your paper. And I think too, this is a common pitfall for all of us probably, is that you can just get really lost in your data. Sometimes I feel like I'm maybe like a dog just chasing my tail because there's so many questions I can ask with a specific data set. But once you write down your objectives, you can use that as a roadmap and always go back and revisit your objectives as you're writing your paper. And then it's also okay to change your objectives. So many of you will probably write a proposal early on in graduate school. It's okay if those objectives morph and change over time. Things may not work out quite like you would expect, or maybe there's something else that's interesting that's popping up. It's good to have a foundation, but then also it's okay if your objectives change over time as well. So as students are starting to try to write a paper or think about writing a paper, I always recommend making your tables and figures first, because there are a lot of trial and error, And then the tables and figures actually help you really visualize your data as well, especially if they're figures. And what I like to do is make my tables and figures and print them all out and just look at them and write notes on what they say. So what's the story? And you don't have to necessarily print them out. Sometimes I get a PowerPoint presentation. So I'll make a PowerPoint presentation with all of my figures, and then use the notes section in the bottom of my PowerPoint presentation to try to understand what the data is telling me, or what's it showing me, or what that trend is. And then it's also good to share it with your advisor or lab mates or other people you have available on campus, because they may see something different. A different trend might pop out that's interesting. So I think it's good to get all of those figured out first. You may have to redo them down the road, but I like having the tables and figures early on. So most papers have the same core parts. There can be differences based on the type of submission, but generally you'll see an abstract, an introduction, methods, results, conclusion, acknowledgements, and references. The abstract part, I think, is one of the most important parts to write well, because when your paper goes out for review, usually that's what the reviewers see when they decide whether or not to review your paper. And it's usually what people read first during the review process. And also maybe the only thing they read once your paper is published is just they'll skim the abstract to see if they want to read the rest. So you write it last, but don't neglect it, because it's very, very important. And I see a lot of abstracts that are maybe not the highest quality because people run out of steam at the end. The introduction is something that you can work on very early in graduate school. A lot of students will write a literature review first, and that'll be the basis of their introduction for a paper later. If you're writing a literature review as part of your thesis or dissertation as a chapter, usually it's really, really long, but for a publication, you have to trim it up so you're telling a more concise story. So I usually try to have the first paragraph be the broad justification. What's the broad reason we're doing this research? And then the middle portion of your introduction should be, what does the literature say about this topic? What is known? But then also point to what's unknown. So we know this and this and this, but we don't know how this works in this situation. So the middle paragraphs are what do we know, but also highlighting those gaps, because you are going to need to prove to the reviewers that your research fills some void in the literature or existing knowledge base. So that's important to have outlined well. And then the last paragraph, usually you'll see, again, a summary of the gaps in the research. And because of this, my objectives are, and then you can write out your objectives very explicitly there. The methods, you can write this early on too. I think it's best if students write it during their first field season, if you're doing a field project, because then you can use it as a good reference for the second year, because you want to be very consistent with your measurements year to year. So this can vary how you write your methods, but I usually try to dedicate the first paragraph to the design, the treatments, the reps, the locations, because that's really important to have upfront and clear for reviewers. And then you'll need all of the details about what you did. So the planting dates, the harvest dates, your soil series, crop rotation, cultivar tillage, fertilizer application, all of those management practices need to be outlined in your method section. You also have to have a very detailed measurements and how you took the measurements. So people could repeat your study. So you need to have it as a level of detail where someone else could take the exact same measurements in the same way. And then usually the last paragraph of the method section is how you analyzed your data. And this is a really important part to write well with enough detail where people could repeat your analysis. So the conclusion, I think I said save your abstract for last. The conclusion is something you do at the last portion as well. For applied journals, I like to think of it as what is the farmer recommendation. So sometimes I tell my students, if they have family that farms, what would you tell your dad? Or what would you tell your family member who farms? What's the farmer recommendation as an outcome of your research? I find the conclusions to be really tricky because you want to say something, but also you have to be very careful to not overextend what your data set says and what you tested and where you tested it. So usually when I get papers back, a lot of times reviewers will have me relook at the conclusions because I'm not the best conclusion writer. Any questions about that before I move on to some information about journals? That was a speed version. So impact factor is something you guys have probably heard of at some point. So Nature, very high impact factor journal, about 65 in 2022. So that means papers published 2 years earlier in 2020 and 2021 received about 65 citations in 2022. So the journals that are very common to submit to as applied researchers are Agronomy Journal, Crop Science, AEL is Agricultural and Environmental Letters, and then CFTM is Crop, Forage, and Turf Grass Management. All of these journals are managed by the tri-societies. So you see the impact factors here for the first 3 journals, 2.1 to 2.6. So compared to Nature, they're pretty low. Crop, Forage, Turf Grass Management has an impact factor of 0.6. So very low impact factor. They just received an impact factor, I believe, this year. So they're kind of new to that. Before they had 0 impact factor. All of these journals that are in the tri-societies have speed to first decision. So this is on their website. So you can look at that. So there's a big variety in average speed to first decision. Crop, Forage, Turf Grass Management tends to be one of the longer ones. It averages 49 days. Crop Science is quicker. It's 11 days. That's quicker is not always better. I've had Crop Science papers rejected 2 days after I submit them. So be a little wary. Quicker doesn't mean that's necessarily good. The website for all these journals also has the acceptance rate. So you can see Crop, Forage, Turf Grass Management, days to first decision is a little bit on the longer side, but the acceptance rate is 65%. Crop Science is down to 28%. Agronomy Journal is 26%. So you can have a lot of variability in the acceptance rate. The audience of these journals can vary quite a bit. This is, again, I pulled it right from their website. Crop Science didn't have anything listed. Agronomy Journal and AEL are targeted for researchers. Crop, Forage, Turf Grass Management Journal is for researchers, practitioners, educators, industry reps. So it tends to be a little bit more applied type research. With that, it's also English unit. So if you're submitting from a US-based institution, you're required to put everything into English units, where the other journals mostly require metric unit. You'll see a lot of variability in word limits. So Agronomy Journal and Crop Science have no word limit. So sometimes I see papers that are like a 50-page PDF, extremely long. AEL is for rapid communication. So 2,500 word limit, and Crop, Forage, Turf Grass Management is 3,000 word limit. And then access. So sometimes, oops, you need to pay for open access. Sometimes the journals are just open access by nature. So AEL is open access, where the other journals you have to pay for open access. The caveat is some of you may have agreements at your institution with the journals. So for example, I can publish in Agronomy Journal, Crop Science, and CFTM for free, open access, because Ohio State has an agreement with the journals. And so there's a Big Ten agreement with these journals. So if you're part of the Big Ten, you may be able to get open access for free. And some of the journals just waive their page charges as well. One of those is CFTM. So I can publish with no page charge, open access for free in CFTM, which is really nice because publications can sometimes easily go to $800, $900, $1,000. So I always like to remind people too that impact factor is not everything. It's okay sometimes to publish in a journal that's a lower impact as long as it's relevant to your audience and what you're doing. So I publish a lot in crop, forage, and turfgrass management because its target audience is practitioners. And so I do applied research, and that's a really good outlet for what I do. You can also have your article selected for CCA, CEU credit, so that's Certified Crop Advisor Continuing Education Unit. So a lot of times when I submit my paper and publish it in crop, forage, turfgrass management, I get an email saying, hey, do you want to write a 10-question quiz for CCAs that goes along with your article? And I always do it because it's a really good way to show that people are using my research and document impact for my annual review. And if you get your paper selected for that, your paper is now available, I think, to like 15,000 CCAs in the US, Canada, Mexico. So I find that to be really valuable. CFTM is more useful for me in extension because then if I make a graph that's all in English units, I can use that graph directly for my extension program. Whereas if I publish in Agronomy Journal and it's all in metric, then I always have to have a second graph for extension that's in English units. Any questions about that?
Hey, Laura.
Yeah, go ahead.
I do have a question for you, Laura. So since these are graduate students, some who will be wanting to go on the job market, maybe in academia, have you ever seen like a search committee look at the impact factor of a candidate?
Yeah, so I've heard like in our department, sometimes they'll count how many first author and how many last author. So I feel like our department will emphasize first author or last author publications. You know, in the position of a graduate student, like first author is going to look good. I don't know. We've had a lot of extension people hired recently at Ohio State. And I feel like with extension positions, just publications in general are important. Maybe if you were in a different, more basic area of research, impact factor would matter more. I know that I was criticized a little bit when I went up for promotion because I did have so many articles in crop, forage, and turfgrass management. So having a mix is good. So maybe a couple in crop, forage, turfgrass management, and maybe a couple in crop science or agronomy journal, which is a little bit higher. But I think a good mix is good, but I think it's going to depend a lot on your institution. I don't know, Rachel, if it's different at NC State.
No, I've never heard anybody talk about the impact factor of a candidate, whether it be extension or even like research and teaching position. So I was just curious if anybody else had heard of that before.
I know for like promotion and tenure, that might come into play a little bit more as you're going to like assistant to associate, but for entry level academic positions, I don't think it's come up as much. Any other questions or comments? All right. So I think another thing that's good is to be familiar with article types. Sometimes we think we have to have our whole field season done or all of our data done to publish, but there's other articles you can publish if you're not done with your research yet. So one would be a review article. So if you're writing a literature review, and you're writing it in a way that it could be submitted to as a review article, that could be really useful. Review articles tend to get more citations, so that can be nice to track as you're applying for jobs or going up for promotions. There's briefs. So Crop Forward Turfgrass Management has a brief section. So sometimes we do a lot of little field studies that are maybe not a full-blown research article, but it's still replicated in time or space. You could submit it as a brief, and I've done this a few times, especially with on-farm research where maybe I don't have quite as detailed measurements. Of course, there's your regular research article that you're all familiar with. And there's also diagnostic guides and management guides. I think these are really underutilized. I know they're underutilized. So if you are doing a study that requires you to take a lot of pictures of a nutrient deficiency, you could submit that as a diagnostic guide to help farmers diagnose nutrient deficiencies, or management guides. They're very similar to an extension bulletin or extension fact sheet, but it's peer reviewed. So that those count for more, a peer review publication counts for more than a fact sheet or a bulletin that's internal. So if you have anything that would lend itself to a diagnostic guide or a management guide, I would encourage you to maybe seek those opportunities out for publication. So it's also good to familiarize yourself with the journal style guide. So some of them are fairly similar, but some of them will be different. So each journal website has a style guide you can download. And there's also individual journal resources that are available. So with the Tri-Society journals, they all have a downloadable Word template. So I always like to download it to get started. And I think they all have pre-submission checklists, so that you can go through that checklist before you submit to make sure you've met all the requirements. If you don't, and you submit your paper, it can be sent back immediately, and that just makes things take longer. For an example, with crop forage turfgrass management, we require English units. If you submit it in metric, they're just going to bounce it back to you. So doing it correctly the first time is important. So common reasons for a rejection, I think these are always good to keep in mind. So I think probably the number one reason people get their papers rejected is because of the method section. I know when I review papers, I usually read the abstract first, so I get an idea of what they're doing, and then I jump to the method section, because if their methods are wrong, I'm not going to waste my time reading the whole paper. I might skim it, but the methods are really important. Most journals will require replication in time and or space. So that means multiple years and or multiple locations. And you have to be really clear with your experimental design, number of treatment replications and treatments themselves. If people don't understand this, then they're probably just going to reject it. So just make sure you're very, very clear about what you did. I see papers get rejected because the analysis is not appropriate. One big one is if there's interactions, but then the authors maybe are just giving main effects, since they're not describing what they found in a way that makes sense based on the analysis. Sometimes papers are outside the scope of the journal. I think this is probably a little bit more rare, but this happens as well. You might get something rejected immediately because it's outside the journal scope. So understanding what their scope is important. And sometimes reviewers just misunderstand what you did. This could be because the reviewer didn't do a very good job and they didn't try very hard, or it may be because your writing is unclear. So sometimes if reviewers don't understand what you did, it's good to go back and relook at your writing and see if it was clear or not, because a misunderstanding can mean that your writing may have been problematic. So again, with the methods, I said it's good to be extremely specific. So having all the materials listed in a way that makes sense, the GPS locations, latitude, longitude for your field trials, the soil descriptions, even if it's not a soil related project, if you don't include the soil information, they'll ask for it anyways. I think the most important place to be very clear is the experimental design. So I almost write out exactly the same phrase every time I write a paper. The experimental design was a randomized complete block design with 4 replications of each treatment. So just really spell it out so no one is guessing what you did. And then very explicitly write what your main plot factor was, what your subplot factor was, and all of the treatments. Sometimes it's hard if you have a very complex experiment to write out all of the treatments in text. So if it's really hard to do that, you might want to make a table. So I see people write, treatments 1 through 12 and then put all the treatments in a table, and that can be a nice way to show it. If it's simple enough, you can write it out in text, but just make sure it's really, really clear. And then I see people make really broad statements as well, or not have enough context to their statements. So I'll pick on Fabiano since he's on the call. He's working on biological seed treatments for soybean. And so a lot of the research, preliminary research he'll use for maybe his introduction are based on lab studies. And it works wonderful in the lab. So Fabiano talks about how these things work wonderful, but fails to mention it's in the lab. Well, that's not adequate context. If something works really, really well or doesn't work really, really well, you just say, oh, it was in the lab or it was in the field. Or sometimes things will work in North Carolina, but it's different in Ohio. It may not work here. So adding context in your introduction statement or results, if you're looking at other research to how it was done, can be really important. And then also avoid giving really broad statements. Sometimes I see people write really broad statements, and it's better to be very specific, not so broad. Colloquial language. This is another thing. Someone have a question?
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So if I have like greenhouse studies to complement my field studies, do you think it should be replicated like 2 times, 3 times? I don't know.
Yes. Yeah. So if you're doing a greenhouse study, you should have, we call them runs. I don't know if that's the right word or not, but usually we try to do 2 runs in the greenhouse, which would be like similar to 2 years in a field.
In the field. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you.
I've seen greenhouse papers rejected because they don't have two runs within the greenhouse.
Yeah, I have published one, but I have like 1 field and 1 greenhouse, and they accepted. But
yeah.
Right now they're saying that probably replicating the greenhouse. No.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? So colloquial language, colloquial means just words that are used in ordinary or familiar conversation. So I put a link to an article here if you're interested, but basically this is a quote from the article. All of us have these areas that we know a lot about, music, cooking, sports, whatever. And we use a language to communicate these these interests or these things that we're very, very familiar with. And the same can be said with agriculture, especially if you're working with farmers. So we become really proficient, I think, in this second language of communicating what we're doing that readers outside of your area may not be familiar with those types of words. And so this happens a lot in agriculture, where we just use words that are not necessarily going to be familiar to everyone if they're not in our discipline. So this is another quote from the article, but they're just encouraging people to read their papers, and if it doesn't make sense to you, it's probably not going to make sense to an outside person or be clear to another person. So I just try to avoid that. And I have some examples here. These are from former students. So This one here, winter malting barley has been securing a place in Ohio crop rotations with just under 10,000 acres planted in 2019. So securing a place is not very specific. So I had the student rewrite it. In Ohio, winter malting barley acreage is increasing with almost 10,000 acres planted in 2019. So securing a place I felt was a little bit unclear, and so we tried to make that more specific. This is another one. Mid 2014 through the early months of 2018, soybean prices hovered. Then it dropped to the lowest levels in 2009 in February of 2016. So with this one, hovered was kind of a strange word to describe prices. So I had them simplify it from 2014 through early 2018. Soybean prices ranged from and then dropped in February 2016, the lowest price since 2009. So just trying to avoid maybe some of those words. So this is my favorite hack when it comes to writing, and I don't know if anyone else has used this. Fabiano probably has now. No, he will. I've had a student, I guess I'll tell you what my hack is first. So I really like to use the read aloud feature in Word. So if you're have a Word document, you can go up to review and click read out loud. And Word will read it to you and highlight each word as it reads it. And I find a lot of mistakes in my writing when I have someone else, the computer, read it to me out loud. And I know I recommended it to a student once for years and they never did it. And then the one time they did it, they thought it was the best thing ever and caught a bunch of mistakes. So I do this even for my journal not my journal articles, my extension articles. So I write a lot of newsletter articles for farmers. I'll almost always use the read out loud feature in Word to find my mistakes. So if you haven't done that yet, I would strongly recommend it. Color figure policy. So this is a new requirement with the Tri-Society journals is to have this policy for greater accessibility of figures and graphs. And so I just put a few bullet points highlighting their new policy. It's more detailed online, so the bottom link will have the full policy, but this is important to know exists. I use a website called Color Brewer, and I had a former student recommend this website to me. If you go to the Color Brewer website, you can put in how many colors you need. So let's say you need 5 different colors for a graph. You can say you need 5 colors and then click a box that says colorblind safe, and it'll give you colors that will be safe for people who are colorblind. So I find that useful. And also too, for the policy, if you're making like a line graph, just don't make all the symbols the same. So they're suggesting using different types of lines or different symbols. So not only the color is different, but also the symbol is different. Okay, so what to expect from the review process. So I don't know, I can't really see you guys very well. Has anyone went through the review process yet? I know Fabiano had 2 papers accepted. Probably a mix. Fabiano had the nicest reviewers ever, and so I don't know how he got lucky. Not everyone gets that lucky, but it can be a painful process. So after you submit a paper, the decisions you usually get are going to be reject, minor revisions, or major revisions. I don't think there's much difference between minor and major revisions. I feel like I've had major revisions that have been fairly minor and then minor revisions that have been pretty major. Except I've never had a paper outright accepted. It would be wonderful. But usually accept comes after you do minor or major revisions, or your article could be transferred to another journal. So sometimes if papers are not replicated in time or space, they may not meet a certain journal requirement. So I've seen them transferred to a different journal within the Tri-Societies called AGE. I think it's Agro Ecosystems, Geosciences, and the Environment. So that's for papers that may not have as much replication. So you can also have papers transferred. More often than not, if I get a paper rejected, I'll submit it to a different journal. This is a paper I had rejected. And so I just highlighted some of the key comments. They felt that some of the data was missing, or I used vague terminology. The sampling method wasn't clear. So I'm not going to appeal that because those are fair comments. But what I did was I took those comments to heart. I revised the paper and then I submitted to a different journal, and then it was accepted in that other journal. So this is probably a more common pathway to get your work published if it's rejected the first time. If you get major or minor revisions, it's great, but also really depressing sometimes when you look at everything that you need to do to fix your paper. So you do have to respond to those review comments. You need to be very organized and complete in your responses. A lot of times you'll revise your paper and resubmit the paper or the revised paper, and it'll go back out to reviewers. They're not going to remember what your paper said the first time because it's probably could be several weeks. So having all of your responses very organized and very clear is helpful. So I like to start by putting all of the review comments into a Word document. This can be a pain because a lot of reviewers will take the PDF and just put comments in the PDF. And so I have to then transfer those PDF comments into a Word document, but I always take the time to do it because I want to be very clear in my response to review comments. This is an example, it's kind of blurry, but I put all of the review comments in bold and then my responses following and not bold, so they can see line by line the changes that I made. And then I highlight the edits in a Word document, the revised Word document of the paper. You can also use track changes to show people what you did, but sometimes I think track changes looks a little bit sloppy and it's harder to read. So I tend to just highlight the things that I changed. My strategy when I'm responding to review comments is to make the easy edits first. So the typos, rewording, and then sometimes there's really challenging edits where they want me to look at something deeper or a different way. I usually save those for last so I can kind of think about them for a little bit longer. So one mistake that I see people make is that they don't respond adequately to revisions or to review comments. So you don't have to agree with all of the comments a reviewer makes, but you do have to respond thoroughly to all of the comments. You can disagree, but be polite and explain why you disagree. The explanation is really, really, really important. Yeah, and also sometimes review comments may be conflicting. If that happens, I try to look at the associate editor or the higher up editor first over the reviewers, but just make sure you thoroughly and politely respond to all of the review comments. English. So there's a lot of reviewers that will be pretty rude based on English or other aspects, age. If they think you're younger somehow, then they can be rude. But you'll probably run across rude reviewers at some point. I think the most important thing is don't be that person once you're in a stage where you're reviewing other people's work. Don't be rude. But you know, sometimes reviewers will make assumptions based on your name or where you're located. Sometimes reviewers will edit more than actually evaluate the science. And so sometimes they focus a lot on grammar and things like that. If it's too challenging to read because the grammar is so poor, your paper could get suggested to English language services to help with that. It can be really expensive, so it's probably not the best pathway, but I've seen that happen. When you're reviewing a paper, this article here says, don't demand a native English speaker because just because you're a native English speaker does not mean you're a good writer. There's a lot of native English speakers who are extremely bad writers. So if you're reviewing a paper and you don't understand what's written, it's better to suggest help from someone with full professional proficiency in English. So a lot of times when I see papers come through, they'll compliment people on English or not. So just be aware of that. That's probably going to happen at some point.